Hello, welcome to this video on short-run, long-run costs and diminishing returns. So in this video, we're going to look at the relationship between short-run and long-run costs, and we're going to look at deriving cost curves from the assumption of diminishing marginal productivity. Bear with me, we'll pick this apart as we go through the video. So as we know in economics, we have the factors of production, and these are the inputs that are available to firms to combine to generate goods and services that people want. Now, if we're thinking now about the short run and the long run, what we assume as economists is that in the short run, at least one of the factors is fixed. So if you think about all our factors of production, we're assuming here in the short run there's going to be a limit to the amount of one of these factors of production. And normally that's going to be capital. So say we have a factory or machines, we might have one machine, one factory, and that's fixed in the short run. We can add raw materials, we can add workers, but the amount of capital is going to be fixed. It could also be land. So in the short run, businesses are constrained with fixed and variable factors, typically fixed factors. The difference we assume in the long run is that all factors of production are variable, and the scale of production can also change, allowing the firm to benefit from economies of scale. So we assume here in the long run that we can add more factories, add more capital. Nothing is fixed and finite in its amounts. We should just note that the length of the short run will vary by industry. So short run production is a period in time when at least one factor of production is in fixed supply. A business has chosen its scale of production, so its size. We've chosen one factory, or we've chosen two factories, or one piece of machinery, and we stick with this in the short run period. We can't suddenly become a lot bigger or a lot smaller. We assume often that the quantity of plant and machinery is fixed, and that production can be altered within some variables by changing variable inputs such as labor, raw materials, and energy, but we can't change the fundamental amount of capital, so our machinery in our factories, for example. So we often talk about two types of factor input, or there are often two types of factor input, fixed and variable, and often the ones that we say are in short supply, the fixed factor inputs, so capital and land. In the short run then, how much a firm produces, its productivity, is very closely linked to the workers and labour. Now we're going to look at what we mean by the term diminishing returns. So in the short run, at least one factor of production is fixed, normally capital, but can also be land. The law of diminishing returns states that as more units of a variable input are added to fixed amounts of land and capital, the change in total output will first rise and then fall. So this is an important concept for us to think about here. So let's make sure we have this one down. The law of diminishing returns states that as we add more units of a variable input, so perhaps as we add more workers to use our machine, initially we have a rise in total output. But then ultimately, if we keep on doing this, add more and more workers, we might have a fall in total output. And this phenomena is called the law of diminishing returns. Let's look at some examples. So you might think about teaching in a lesson, and your teacher is standing at the front and they've been talking for, let's say in the first instance, they've been talking for 5 minutes. And you get a lot of information, you think this is really great, 5 minutes in I really hear what you're saying. After 35 minutes, well, you're starting to feel a bit bored. The value of everything the teacher is saying is starting to become a bit monotonous, a bit boring. What time is it? You're starting to move. After 55 minutes, actually you're not learning anything more. You're actually so angry the teacher's still talking, you're forgetting the stuff they covered at the start of the lesson. So here, the initial use of teacher's time has a large benefit, and then that starts to decline as you get bored, and by the end, you're so annoyed that you've started to actually forget stuff. You might have heard this phrase, too many cooks spoil the broth. That's another example of diminishing returns. So we have the first chef who adds something to the broth, and that makes it taste better. We might even have the second chef who's added something to the broth. And again, it might taste better, but maybe not quite as better. The impact might have diminished slightly. By the time this chap on the right has stuck in all sorts of chili powder and salt and pepper, actually, he's made the broth worse than in the starting place. So here we've seen, if we were to sort of plot it out, an increase in the taste of the soup from the first chef, then it's plateaued with the second chef, and by the time we get to the third chef, actually he's ruined it. And so here we get a little graph, and we can say that as we add more chefs, our soup gets worse. The returns of adding more people to the fixed soup, the fixed pot, the capital, gets worse. A final example. Let's imagine we have one tractor and no workers. If we were to add the first worker to our tractor, then this might have a benefit. They might be able to harvest maybe 10 bales of hay. Then we add our second worker, and actually there might be a really good benefit because now we can have one worker gathering the hay whilst the other worker is putting it into the back of the tractor. And so let's say the output goes up to 22. So this worker has actually increased output by 12. Then we add a third worker and output goes up to 30. Okay, that worker wasn't quite so useful, but we've still increased. By the time we try and introduce the sixth worker, we find that actually they're all squabbling to get on the tractor. They can't fit. It's not really going to go anywhere. And actually output has gone back down to 15. So the impact of this last worker here is actually to reduce the returns. There'd be negative returns from the introduction of this extra worker. This is what we mean by the marginal product of labour. How much extra does an extra worker add? So the marginal product of labour is the additional return generated from adding an extra worker. Here's a quick example. On the left-hand side, we can see the number of employees, the number of workers employed, and we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then we can see the output. So if we have one worker, output will be how many will produce 8 units. If it's 2 workers, 20 units, and so on. Then we have marginal product and average product. So let's have a look here. The marginal product of labour, the extra product from adding one worker. Well, from going from 1 to 2, output has gone from 8 to 20, so we've added 12. So the marginal product of labour here is 12. When we add another worker, we go to 3 workers. We go from 20 to 36. The marginal product here, well, that worker has added 16. In the column further, the next column to the right, we can see the average product. So here, if we have 3 workers and between them they produce 36 units, the average product is 12. And so what's happening here in terms of the returns to extra labour? Well, here, as we add workers 2 and workers 3, it's rising. It's gone from 8 to 12 and then from 12 to 16. So we're getting an extra return from adding more people. What happens once we add the 4th person? Well, actually we add on 12, but that's not as much as it was previously, 16. So the returns are diminishing. And we can see when we add on the 5th person, it goes down to 8. And when we add on the 6th person, it goes down to 5. So they're diminishing. At some point here, actually, by adding the 5th and 6th people, we're bringing down the average product. The amount of product that's being made per person is actually starting to decrease when the marginal product drops below the current average. So when diminishing returns set in, the marginal product of labour starts to fall. Okay, we're adding extra workers, but they're not adding as much impact every time. When the marginal product of labour declines below the existing average product, then the average product of labour, what each worker produces on average, will start to fall. And we can see here that that occurs when we add the 5th and 6th worker in our example. So how does this then link to cost? Well, if the returns from each extra worker are falling, then each extra worker must be increasing, adding our costs. and they are less cost effective than the previous worker. So if I hire an extra worker and actually they're only producing 8 more units and the previous worker produced 10 more units, the relative cost of that extra worker is higher. So it's going to lead to an increase in costs. So as returns decrease, as the marginal product of labour falls, costs increase, and vice versa. So our short-run law of diminishing returns, a quick summary and recap to see where this is taking us. In the short run, at least one factor of production is fixed, normally capital, so our tractor, for example. It can also be land or any other factor of production. And as we add more units of a variable input to that fixed amount, so as we add more workers to that tractor, the change in total output will first rise and then eventually fall. Diminishing returns to labour occur when marginal product of labour starts to fall, as you saw in the previous example. This means that total output will be increasing, but at a decreasing rate. So here's a good example of what we're talking about. As we add more people, the marginal product of labour is positive. We get an accelerating gradient. Then there comes a stage where actually, by employing more people, total output is going up, but it's slowing down. And here we have diminishing returns. Each extra worker is not adding as much total output. Here we have our point of maximum yield. It's the maximum we can produce, given our fixed capital in the short run. And then eventually, if we keep adding workers, they get in each other's way, we might get negative returns. So we've looked at the relationship here between the short run and the long run. And now we're going to tie this assumption here we've made about diminishing marginal returns, diminishing marginal productivity, into the impact on costs. So this is why we have a U-shaped marginal cost curve. Initially, we get increasing returns. So we can see that as returns increase, the relative cost of employing each extra worker starts to fall. But then we get to a point where actually adding each extra worker, because the marginal productivity falls and they're adding less and less total output, the relative cost of adding those workers means that the cost of each additional worker starts to rise. And so we get initially a fall in marginal cost when marginal product is increasing, and then when marginal product starts to fall, we get a rise in marginal cost. So we get this U-shaped marginal cost curve, and this is how we always draw it. How does that then relate to our average cost curve? Well, remember, whilst the cost of each additional unit is below the current average, this will have the impact of bringing our average down. Like if we have the average height in a class and we keep adding people who are below the current average height, the average height in the class will come down. But as the marginal cost continues to rise, this effect wears off and the average cost curve starts to level out to the point where the marginal cost equals the average cost. Once the marginal cost starts to rise above the average, this has the impact of pulling the average up. So we will always see this shape. The marginal cost is a U curve, and then the AC curve, we always know that it will intersect the marginal cost at its lowest point. So in this video, we've looked at the relationship between short run and long run costs. We've investigated this concept of diminishing marginal productivity and diminishing returns. And we've looked at how that gives rise to our marginal cost curve and our average cost curve. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.